presidents of the independent agencies of Greece, members of the Parliament Committee on Research and Development, high-level officials from the state and of the communication and information technology sector, welcome and thank you for coming to the event. We are very happy to have with us today Dr. Kahn, and as you probably all know, Dr. Kahn is the father of the internet. When ΕΕΤΤ extended the invitation to him, we were quite thrilled that he accepted to put Athens on his busy schedule and busy travel itinerary to come here and share with us some of his experiences, ideas, problems, hurdles that they went through in developing, or designing, building, developing, and enhancing the internet. I will not read all of his resume that you, I think, we have received with the invitation. I only want to say that he was one of the first pioneers in working for the DARPA defense agency. He coined the term National Information Infrastructure, which was later known widely as the Information Superhighway. He was in a number of presidential boards and councils of the United States. His talk today will be on the internet, past, present, and future. He will share with us some of his experiences, how things started when he and Professor Lenny Kleinrock at UCLA were trying to do the first exchange of a digital message, how they later invited Vint Cerf to join the group. He will tell us what are some of the current challenges, what are some of the opportunities, what made internet the modern agora, where everybody gathers and freely and openly says and writes and speaks his or her mind freely. At the end of his presentation, he may be willing to take a few questions from the audience. And then now I would like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Kahn at this event that is organized by ΕΕΤΤ. Bob, thank you.
Hey, thank you, Nikitas, for that very nice introduction. Actually, I have a feeling that I should be inviting you to give the talk with that very nice overview of all the topics that you would like me to talk about. I think we probably don't have enough time to touch on everything, but let me share with you some of my thoughts about the internet, where it's been, where it is today, and where it's likely to head in the future. As many of you know, the internet really had its origins some 35 years ago when a few of us were very actively involved in developing a communications switching technique called packet switching. And the very first network that was built that supported that was called the ARPANET. I was the chief designer of that net. We actually built it, deployed it, and it became the kind of the glue that held together the computer science research community in the United States for many years. At the time, I mean, if you followed my career, I had started it out at Bell Laboratories in a very different kind of era than we're in now. We had the single main telecommunications carrier in the US back then. Right now it's a more diverse and competitive environment. Bell Laboratories was probably the premier research establishment in the communications business. That's where I started my career. I got back to the university, got a doctoral degree, and went to teach on the faculty at MIT. and took a leave of absence to essentially get involved in designing and then building the very first computer network. We were sufficiently successful at that DARPA offered me a position in the Defense Department, essentially running a large part of the research establishment of the government in information technology, and I eventually became the director of that office. It was while I was at DARPA that the idea of generating the internet came about, and historically it was because I had taken the initiative to create a ground radio network, a kind of precursor of today's CDMA technology. We called it packet radio. And to shape another network that had been in process but was literally an extension of the ARPANET to Europe. And I turned that into a satellite network on Intelsat 4. We had linkages into 4 European countries for collaborative experiments. Greece was not one of them, but we had linkages into Italy, Norway, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And that set of 3 networks, the packet radio, the satellite net, and the ARPANET, were the motivation for the Internet project. Namely, how would one go about linking 3 very different nets with rather different technologies and the computers that were on them into one seamless whole? And that's where the idea really came from. Many people today think that they understand that the internet consists of all these routers and lines and switches and computers. But to me, the internet was always a logical architecture. It was a means of allowing for these machines and networks to federate. And therefore, it was designed to be independent of any network technology that may become part of it. To many people today, that seems like a hard thing to fathom, because if it's just this architecture, it doesn't have any physical realization. And of course, there is the physical realization of that architecture at any point in time. So what it did was it achieved independent involvement of different networks. As a logical architecture, it was really implemented by virtue of protocols that defined the interfaces between the components. Many people thought that the Ethernet was really done as part of that, but that was actually something that happened in parallel from researchers at Xerox PARC. And although the Ethernet became the most dominant network on the internet, it was not really part of the internet, but it fit in perfectly because we were able to absorb virtually any kind of network technology as part of the internet. And of course, it later led to commercialization, and of course its global acceptance as a kind of vehicle for worldwide connectivity. Most people know the internet as a research activity in its early days. Very few people know what actually caused it to become commercial. In fact, there had to be a first commercial application on the internet. Very few people understand that my organization actually got the permission to do the first commercial application, 1988 roughly, which was the connection of the MCI mail system to the internet. The internet itself as a contribution certainly has demonstrated a lot of practical utility for things that you take for granted today, like email and maybe surfing the web. But I believe its real contribution was as an open architecture, because, and I'll say what that is in a moment, but without an open architecture, it would have been very difficult for all the parties that participated in it to become part of the rollout of the internet around the world. What we had initially was something that was controlled by one company. We ended up in a situation where many different companies could control parts of it and generally help to evolve it. Open architecture really lets you get interoperability between different networks and the computers that are on there. It allows you to achieve vendor independence. It really supports the notion of a multi-stakeholder environment where multiple groups can actually create the technology and bring it to the marketplace. And by virtue of allowing for modular implementations, you can focus on the relevant pieces of it and allow them to evolve independently. Those are the key attributes of open architecture. That is, multi-stakeholder involvement in different pieces that are modularly constructed and with defined protocols that cause the pieces to link together in useful ways. A couple of other things about the Internet is it allowed for uniform access to any site on it right from the get-go, where the users determined who could access their machines and what access controls were appropriate. There were no second-class citizens on the Internet. If you got on the Internet, you might have to decide what kind of access speed you would like and have to pay accordingly. But once you were on the Internet, it was sort of fair game. You could go anywhere, you could do anything you want. And that's still pretty much the way it is today. I gave a talk recently in Washington to a group of young kids. And one of the young ladies got up in the audience and said to me, she really thought the Internet was a wonderful invention and they make use of it all the time. But how did we go about convincing all the governments of the world to let the Internet happen? And I sort of smiled at that question because, if you put yourself back in the time frame when we were doing this work, I think it's fair to say that nobody really took it that seriously. Nobody thought that this would be as broad-based a capability as it is, unless the carriers themselves decided to make it that way. And they weren't that much interested. If you think about the early 1970s, the only organizations that could afford the large time-sharing systems that the Internet was designed to interconnect originally, were maybe they numbered 50 or 100 in all. This was not a market. This was not a business. None of the carriers really saw it that way. It was a thing that was being done within the research community for researchers, and that was fine as far as they were concerned. Let the researchers figure out what this is all about. If it ever comes time to deploy this commercially, the carriers will do it. Well, it took on a life of its own, and I think Europe was part of the process of making that happen. It, in fact, had international tentacles right from day one. The very first contracts that we gave to build the protocols that were the key protocols of the Internet went to a place in California at Stanford where Ben Cerf was, a place in Boston at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman where I had done the ARPANET work originally, and went to University College in London to participate in that development. But very quickly we had participation from a half a dozen countries in Europe, and shortly thereafter we had some participation from the Asia Pacific region as well. In the mid-1980s, when DARPA decided to get out of supportive networking, the ARPANET was the dominant network in the United States, and it was central to much of what went on around the world. But the National Science Foundation supported their own network at a higher speed called the NSFNet, and very soon thereafter, because it was so successful, DARPA decided to decommission the ARPANET in 1990. The NSFNet became the backbone of the communications within the United States. One of their main goals early on was to build linkages in the international space. They had a separate program manager just responsible for that. And I think they started out with connections to most of the countries in Europe. And I still have the letter that the folks in Japan got from the National Science Foundation, because they didn't believe that they would be allowed to connect to this US net, but it basically said, you have our permission to connect to the NSF net. That was about all it was a kind of 1 or 2 line letter. There really were no hurdles toward creating the net because, as I said earlier, so few people took it that seriously in those days. I remember, giving a commencement address where, in the United States, where, you know, the student body was just astounded that getting into this field back when I did in the 60s was considered literally betting your career. It was not considered a very fruitful area to get into because most of the computers were large batch machines. They didn't need to communicate. There was no market out there. It just seemed like a very bad choice on the part of an up-and-coming scientist. But the reality was, maybe it's because of you know, internal visions that I had, or because I could see the potential value for this. You have to remember there were no personal computers in the early 70s. There was one dominant carrier. I mean, it was sort of swimming upstream, to say the least. But we persevered, and I think it was the fact that we not only controlled the funding for it, and therefore we could keep the research community involved, but we spent a considerable amount of time and energy developing the standards process itself. And my organization actually has managed that standards process for the last roughly 16 or 18 years, and before that we did it out of government. As of last December, we decided to get out of that activity, so we've now turned it over to another group and set up a trust for all the intellectual property for the internet. But it was a very meaningful 30 years when we had all the responsibility. People now talk about, you know, the U.S. government and its role in the internet, but I have to tell you that for the first 5 or 10 years, we were the government. We were making all the decisions. Every decision about the internet in that first 5 or 10 years, from 1973 through 83, was either made by myself, by Vince Cerf, or by the two of us. And then from 83 on, we spent a considerable amount of our time and energy, right up to the present, trying to figure out how to get the government out of running this, because it seemed to me it really wanted to go into the private sector. And I think, you know, the overwhelming result was that the internet really is in the private sector today. Many of the concerns that people have about the U.S., I think, are ill-founded. The U.S. doesn't really control the internet, doesn't really run any piece of it. And my guess is that some of the concerns that have been expressed, like maybe the U.S. government could take away a domain name from some country, were even desirable by them, which I don't see, and it never has been. I don't even think it would be possible for them to make it happen, given the worldwide distribution of all of those capabilities. So there are many serious issues about the internet that really do need to be dealt with, not the least of which is finding a way to deal with all of the maliciousness, whether it's the spam or the viruses, dealing with the legalism so that you can do good jobs of contracting on the internet, dealing with issues of security, which ultimately become heavily involved with governmental interests in every country of the world. Those are the things that are worth worrying about, and building new capabilities that will not only help the developed countries, but can help some of the developing countries become part of this whole process as well. But I don't see ICANN as being the problem, because it's in fact worked pretty well for a long time and still seems to be just doing fine. One of the areas that I got very interested in a number of years ago when I left ARPA was on the whole area of managing information in the net. Now, almost everybody understands that there's a great opportunity in moving toward a more broadband internet, both in terms of backbone capability and access lines, and that wireless will clearly play a role in the internet going forward. In fact, it already is. Many of you who can surf the web on your cell phones and do email and the like already understand that. But we barely scratched the surface on the issue of information management. And I wanted to sort of give you my perspective on that. When I started the organization that I now run, which is a nonprofit research institute in the Washington area, the thing that I set out to do was answer the question, what would I do differently about the internet? How would I architect it if the main goal was not just to move bits, but to actually help people manage information in that context? How many of you would feel comfortable taking your most sensitive material and trusting it to the network, even if it could be secured so somebody couldn't see it, figuring that you could always retrieve it at any point in time in the future if you really wanted to. If you think about what's happened just in the span of the last 20 or 30 years, any of you here who got email that had a, do you remember something called VisiCalc? Does that mean anything to many people? It was one of the early spreadsheets that was developed. I'll bet most of you would not know what to do to manifest that information, because some of the other spreadsheets programs don't interpret it anymore. But that's only a span of 25 years. If you go out 100 or 1,000 years into the future, then everything about the technology could in principle change. And yet if you trusted your information to the net, it might have moved 100 times. You might have different systems of access that are there, and yet you'd like that technology to still continue to work with whatever the technology is of the day. So that's how I started out, and I'm going to just sort of give you a feeling for what the components are of this particular architecture I came up with. I call it the digital object architecture, and it is an open architecture. So the aim that I had was to provide the same opportunity for organizations in the private sector as well as governments to be able to take advantage of this technology and achieve the benefits of open architecture in managing information. So let me just mention what the elements are of this architecture, and then we can talk a little bit about where things go from there. And before I do, let me start with the issue of data structures. Most of you probably have an intrinsic notion of what it is, but if you think about managing information, one of the things that clearly comes up right from the get-go is the issue of, if you accessed information on the internet, what could you do with it? Or what would you be not permitted to do with it? Right today, you can't tell. If you pull something down from the web, you have no idea what you can do or can't do with it. You might as well assume that you can't do anything because you don't know what you can do. Or if you want to be a little daring, assume you can do anything and wait for a lawsuit to show up. The way things get developed in the data structure world is you start with an idea, and then you turn that idea into a data structure by virtue of taking letters of the alphabet or words from an alphabet and crafting it into sentences and paragraphs and sections. If it's a book, you know, the fact that you may have an idea for a book in your head doesn't make it a book until you've structured that information. And so what we decided was the right primitive part of this was literally to enable data structures to be identified, independent of where they were on the internet, independent of how you might get there, and so forth. That is a very powerful idea, if you think about it. It could be that the national bank, or federal bank of some sort, decides to mint bit sequences that are worth money. Here's a 10 megabyte bit sequence developed through some cryptographic strategy, and the bank says that that bit sequence is worth $100 or equivalent. And you want to manage that bit sequence independent of where it might be. It could be in somebody's wallet, it could be in a machine on the net. In fact, there could be many versions, only one of which is going to be the actual official value. The idea of managing data structures, I believe, is a new idea that originated with this work, and I think it's a very powerful one because you can invest in the identification of these structures independent of what technology will implement it in the future. Well, given that you've got a data structure, the next thing that occurred to me was that you need a way to identify these data structures. You need a shorthand way of talking about it. And if you could give that data structure an identifier, you could share these identifiers, people know exactly what you're talking about. Except that identifiers come in different styles. There are people who think you ought to build into an identifier a lot of information about what you're identifying. I don't come from that school. I think that these identifiers ought to be just plain uninterpretable bit strings for which you need a system that will take this identifier and resolve it into meaningful information about what you're talking about. So it's possible that you could give as your home address, go out the front door 3 miles to the right, turn left at the church 2 miles to the left, go up a small road, and literally that's a description of your house because it says how to get there from, let's say, one place, but the description would be different if you're in some other place. Whereas if you just identified your house by saying your house was 1011101, or some bit string that you knew was unique, it might be that you have the unique identifier of your home, but you have no idea how to get there. You don't know where it is. You need some other system that will take these identifiers and map it into what I call state information about those objects. Many people call it metadata. Some people even call it key metadata. But things that would be interesting to be able to resolve quickly on the net. If you give an identifier for something, you would like to get back the location or maybe the set of locations where you can access that particular object. You might want to get authentication information for it. You might want to get a public key for an individual if that's who you're identifying and the like. So the need for identifiers is clearly critical because it gives you a very effective shorthand way of referring to things. You can send somebody email and say, take a look at this entity, and you can have a little clickable that has behind it one of these identifiers. So they don't actually have to see the identifier or read it. And because these identifiers can be crafted in international codes like Unicode, you don't even have to understand somebody else's version of an identifier as long as you can access it. The system just looks at the bits, the literal uninterpreted bits, to figure out what it is. Now, what's a digital object? A digital object is simply the core elements of this infrastructure. Just like in a packet network environment, the key ingredient are the packets. That's what you're communicating. In an information management world, the key ingredients that you have in these digital objects. And these digital objects are basically, they're structured and you can tell what the pieces are. And I don't want to go into too much detail into what they are, but one of the elements of these objects are their identifier. So it's like an individual has DNA built into them, and let's assume for the moment that that's really unique. These objects have their DNA built in, and they're called identifiers. The term we use for that is handles. Many people use different names. One application of the system that you may be familiar with is something that the publishers have been using for a number of years now, called the DOI, or Digital Object Identifier. These are handles that simply start with the number 10. That system has been widely used in the science and technology arena. Most of the electronic journals that are out there use it for references in the back, which means that if you took these electronic journals off the electronic bookshelf 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, because people are managing it, those identifiers will click without change. It'll be the same citation in the back, but they will click to the right place, independent of what technology is used, independent of what location these data structures are located at. And it's being widely used. I think the German Library of Science and Technology is using it. I know that the European Publications Office for the European Commission is using it. The Library of Congress in the US is using it. There are many different groups that have made advantage of it. And I commend it to you if you're interested. The current site that you can find this technology on the net is called handle.net, www.handle, as in the suitcase handle. .net, and within the next 2 or 3 weeks we're going to reintroduce this site, which allows you to download the software, the kind of public license, open source style, so that anybody can pick it up and be able to work the software and so forth. Just to put it in perspective, we once put the entire DNS system, the main identifier system for the internet, for machines on the internet, on the handle system in preparation for Y2K, and it was a kind of trivial application of the system. I like to liken it to using a crane machine to add 2 and 2 when you can do it on a little pocket calculator. but it clearly will resolve anything, including trivial cases as well as more complicated ones. This particular system is very widely distributed. It was the first general purpose resolution system on the internet. It's been up on the internet since 1994, and it's been 7x24 reliable for, probably 8 years now. If the publishers, find something is down, which happens very rarely, somebody in my organization will get awakened at 3 in the morning and we'll go to fix it, but it happens so rarely that many people are just comfortable running it without any technical support by itself, which is pretty interesting. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but one of the groups that's apparently been making good use of it is the operational folks in China, who are looking for ways to deal with not only the current lack of IP addresses, but how they might deal with IPv6 going forward. And I think the similar thing is true in Japan and some other countries that are being investors in those technologies. So not only is this handle system powerful in terms of what it does, it is totally scalable. I mean, we built it as a flat, scalable system. It's one of the biggest uses is being made of an Open Archives initiative out of Los Alamos, where they have close to 1 billion objects that they're managing. They know exactly where those objects are. They're in a room that's got thousands and thousands of storage units where they're keeping track of it. They're using the handle system to let them know where it is in that room, because they keep bringing in new storage units and moving things around very rapidly, and this lets them manage it even in one room, much less across the whole internet. So the components of this architecture are, number one, digital objects, which are data structures that have unique identifiers, a resolution mechanism that allows you to provide an identifier and resolve it into interesting information about that object, like where it's located. The third component is something called a repository, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. A repository is basically a place where you can store digital objects and from which they can be accessed. But unless you think that this is an attempt to reinvent all the data storage technology, it really isn't. What a repository is kind of a consistent front end to any medium that you might choose to use for storage. It could be, I'm not sure what the most popular systems here are, but if it was in the US, it might be an Oracle database or a Berkeley DB. It could be a Unix flat file system. It could be, just memory chips. It could be any storage system that you want. It could be RAID arrays that you buy. What this does is provide a uniform front end that treats that system as if it were a really big memory chip whose only entities that you're dealing with are not the bits that you might put in a memory chip, but these objects. So what can you do with a repository? You really can do two things in its basics. One is you can deposit these objects into a repository, and number two, you can access the objects that are already deposited. This was an area that we struggled with in the computer science community, because the computer science community thought I was wrong by not treating repositories as the equivalent of a bookshelf. They were into digital libraries at the time, and they thought, well, you put a book on the bookshelf, you take a book off the bookshelf. But if you think about the power of a repository, because you might have many different kinds of queries, you might have an object that might be a movie and you only want the first 2 minutes of the movie. So you wouldn't want to create one object that's the first 2 minutes and another object that's the first 3 minutes and another object that's the first 4 minutes. You'd probably want to say that let's have one object in there, which is the whole movie, and let's disseminate information from that object by virtue of running a program against it. So you have the program that knows how to extract 5 minutes from the movie and disseminate that, or whatever. So that's the basic paradigm here. Access is a matter of running one object against another object to produce dissemination. And in addition to the notion of repository, which, by the way, once you invest in it, allows for interoperability with anybody else who's running a repository. Whether they'll let you access their objects is an administrative matter. Many people won't, especially if it's private materials or secure materials or other materials that they don't want to have access to by anyone else. But if you choose to make your materials accessible, the technology just allows that automatically, independent of what kind of system you use in the future. So you can swap out your Oracle databases and move to the next best thing, and this will still work. And furthermore, you can invest in creating this information once up front and know fully well that no matter what vendor's products you pick in the future, it will still work with them just fine. The fourth component of this capability is what we call a metadata registry. It's kind of like a repository, except that it contains state information about the objects you're talking about. So if you happen to know the identifier of an object, you can just resolve it in the system, go to where that object is, and if you're allowed access to it, you can get it. You might have to pay for it, you might have to be part of a group that's allowed access, but the technology will support that. Whereas if you are not in a position to know what the object was to start with, you might want to look and find, how do I locate objects that talk about the following topic or whatever. Those are what metadata registries are all about. And so for every collection of objects, there's a parallel investment that gets made in the kind of equivalent of cataloging and indexing the object, which are called metadata registries. The handle system is the glue that makes this all play together. And let me just put it in context for you. The handle system comes with built-in administration. So to become a user of this system, you can run out of the global system if you don't want to deploy things in different places, or you can run your own either locally or over some distributed area. But the interesting thing about it is all the administration of these identifiers is subject to the control of the actual user who created them. So you don't have to go through another body or organization in order to change its location or to create new objects and the like. If you put this in context with, let's say, the DNS, there are something on the order of 70 or 80 billion domain names in the DNS. And if you ignore the country codes, which are probably several hundred million more, and just assume the average cost of a domain name is something like $20 a year, you're talking about a number like 1.5 billion, maybe as much as $2 billion that's going into the maintenance of that system. We found in the handle system, because you can distribute the load and all the administration, the cost of running that system is about 3 or 4 orders of magnitude less expensive. And so it's very attractive for people who, in bulk, see all of those resources as being something that they would prefer to put into other things rather than spend on a legacy system, which I happened to pick because it was the best choice at the time, but I think has been overtaken by events. So I commend to you to take a look at this. You can run it yourself in the country, and it's part of this whole open architecture kind of system. For those people who don't want to adapt to the new technology directly, you can still run all the legacy systems. So many people who run web browsers, we keep telling them, if you just run this plugin, we can give it to you, you can write your own, it's much more efficient. They want to use the web browsers the old way, using the DNS, even though they're going into the handle system. And we've made that capability available too by virtue of proxy servers. It's not as efficient, and it's got some reliability issues just because the proxies themselves could fail. But if all the pieces work well, then it works seamlessly, and you can't really tell the difference either. There are many applications for this kind of technology, such as identity management, public key infrastructure. It comes for free. If you ever worried or were concerned about how easy it was for the World Wide Web to populate itself worldwide, it was because the internet was there. And because the handle system is out there, if one wanted to, you could deploy a public key infrastructure almost trivially. But you need to be able to manage the identity of the people that you were identifying. You knew who they were. The area that we're focusing on right now as the highest priority for this area is in the area of network-based storage and archiving. I think this is an area that's going to become increasingly important as individuals learn to trust their important information to the net. If you had to rely on a service like Google for your own personal information, like your medical records, you might not find them. If you tried to locate Hamlet or a play of your favorite sort on the net by putting in those search terms, you might get a lot of articles about Hamlet, you know, major performance at the local conservatory, or a new book written about Hamlet, but you wouldn't get the text itself. You might not get your financial records unless you wanted somebody to get it, and they wouldn't discover it by searching because it probably wouldn't be available. So I think this idea of using the network for storage and access is going to become an extremely important one, and we're about to, you know, do some infrastructure development in the U.S. along those lines ourselves. There are many issues that need to be looked at going forward in that world alone, and in every other application that you can think of. For example, if you pull something out of an archive, want to make some edits to it and put it back in, how do you keep track of versions of the same thing? What do you do when some people are working behind firewalls and they want other people who are outside the firewalls to access it? There are a variety of issues like that that still need to be sorted out, but I'm convinced they will over the coming weeks and months. Finally, I mentioned China earlier on. They are actually looking at the use of the handle system technology to actually house the whole DNS database that they're working with out of China, so that they create handle records for every DNS name, which means that if you access it in the traditional way using bind software, which is how this works on the internet, you get back exactly what the DNS is supposed to give you, the appropriate IP address or naming authority, and that's it. But if you could come into the handle system with just a straight handle access, you get everything that would be in that record, which could be a lot more, and it could be other things as well. So, for example, the notion that you could send email to a book, or a directive of some sort out of the government, the fact that you could ask questions about references of books is all possible in this new structure. And although we haven't talked much about it publicly, I actually believe that the ability to use these identifiers for addressing could be used to help with the network provisioning, operations management of the networks themselves. China actually built a prototype. It turns out to be slightly faster in an apples-to-apples comparison with the bind software, and we can make that technology available to anybody who wants. They are using it within China to help experiment with the alternatives to the DNS itself. So I probably have talked longer than anybody here wants to hear, and I know I'm standing between you and dinner. You did say you would take a number of questions. If people are more anxious to get to dinner, I would understand that too. But let me just conclude by saying that what I think I've described for you in the original internet was a pretty core infrastructure piece. And in this whole digital object architecture, I think we have another